Get started. Okay, so welcome everybody. We're extremely excited to have all of you here. This is Patton's first book study, and we've had an absolutely overwhelming response. We've had 475 of you register, and I'm watching the participant numbers climb right here already. We have 238 of you in this book study. We're very thrilled to have you here. Joining me from Patton are my friends and colleagues, Kirsten DeRoche and Lisa Bola. I'm Dr. Pam Kastner, and I have the honor of serving as Patton State Lead for Literacy. Joining us this evening is none other than the author of this book, along with one of her chapter leads as well, Dr. Elsa Cardenas-Hagen. We'll allow her to introduce herself in just a moment here. Also with us this evening is Chapter 3 lead author, who will be here with us to present in just a few weeks, Dr. Eric Treatise. Please stay on until the end of the session because there will be a poll that will take your attendance. If you would like Act 48 credit, you will need to complete this poll at the conclusion of every one of our book study sessions. There will be 11 sessions in all. You must attend all of them to get Act 48 credit. So that's the housekeeping duties. I won't hold you any longer. We want to spend every minute we can learning from Dr. Cardenas-Hagen. She's going to introduce herself, and we're thrilled to have her here. Welcome, Dr. Cardenas-Hagen.
Much and Happy New Year, everyone, and thank you for joining in this evening. I know you have a million other things to do, but it is so exciting to know that you are interested in working with English learners and interested in knowing, what can I do to help increase their knowledge. And I do thank Patton for inviting me and for being so gracious, guiding me along about how this would all work out. This is my very first book study ever. And so I'm very excited about that. And so I heard some of you say, well, I don't really have the book. And so that's okay. I'm still going to give you some highlights, and then we're really going to get into discussion, kind of moving from the book into, things that we need to think about for application and what we need to do to turn this around. And as Dr. Pam Kastner said, we do have Dr. Eric Treatise, who's joined us this evening, and he will be with us in 2 weeks to describe chapter 3 and have the discussion for chapter 3 with you. So I was really excited when I heard someone say, "Oh, did I have to get the book?" And someone said, "No, but I'm going to order today and I'm going to get on Amazon." So I have a story. I always like to start with a story. When it was released this summer, I was very excited because people were telling me, "Oh, we're getting the book, exciting." And then I saw they started saying, "Well, we can't get it. It's out of stock on Amazon." And so I told my mother, "Oh my God, the book is out of stock already." And a mother always puts you in your place. She said, "Elsa, I'm going to tell you something. They probably only made 2 copies, yours and mine." So don't you then go over there thinking that you sold out. But here's the thing, whether we sell the book or not, and whether this book is used, tonight I have an opportunity to meet. And for those of you that aren't joining live and will join later, 475 persons. And when I think about that, I just think about that times 22 in a classroom, or times 22 times 5 more years of them being in the classroom. And I just think about, we've got to build, this cohort of people knowledgeable to really meet the needs of these students. And so that is my hope, that you will get something out of this. You will learn from this book. The idea of the book really, Brooks Publishing, approached me and asked me if I would write a book that would, really put research to practice. What do we know from research, and what do we need to know for practice? And I love that because, I get to do research, but I would just want to tell you, I'm a practitioner. And right before this, 30 minutes before this, I finished my day seeing kids today and working with children who struggle. So I am not going to be preaching to you anything that I don't do myself. And where do I live? I live on the border between Texas and Mexico, on the very southern tip in Brownsville, Texas. And I do work with the Texas Institute for Measurement, Evaluation, Statistics at the University of Houston. And it's through that arm that I've been able to participate in these, large scale studies for English learners. And we've learned so much, but we've got to get what we know into practice. And so the idea for this book, the purpose of it, is really to share with you, what do we know today? What is the evidence that we have today for our students who are English learners? And what is the most important thing to know about their literacy skills? And so it's so important for you to understand first language development, second language development, and how literacy develops in native and second language, and the differences that we see in when a student has excellent language skills, how beautiful that is for learning that second language and for attaining that second language literacy. In the book, throughout the book, we very clearly, point out key research. And Dr. Treatise, when he does chapter 3, will tell you the large scale, meta-analyses for this population of students and what it means for our practice. And the book also will then get into the key components of literacy instruction and what you can do to differentiate instruction for the English learners. And this is what I always tell people. You don't have to speak the language, their native language, to know how to instruct them as an English learner, right? But it's very good for you to understand somewhat about that language, something about them, something about how their language works, how that structure works, because we can make wonderful, wonderful connections across languages. And this really, really does seem to support their second language literacy. So we want to talk throughout each and every one of these weeks. It starts today, January 14th, and we go every Thursday until March 25th. And so each week will be a different chapter, and some of our contributing authors will be joining us for each of the book chapters. So what the book really is my hope to put in, the knowledge that we've gained from research, the knowledge that we've gained from practice, put it all together, and really by the end of this book study, for you to be very well prepared and very well equipped to help our students who are English learners. And as I begin that, let's talk about, who are these students, and how are we doing? And so as we think about that, we know that we're already close to 5 million English learners. And when we look at that, we think about 5 million English learners who are representing close to 10% of the student population across our country. And you know, the research that I have participated in these last couple of decades has been in Spanish speaking English learners. And the United States government has sponsored these studies, the National Institute of Health and the Institute of Education Sciences, and they focused on the Spanish language at first, this biliteracy initiative that we had. And they did that because close to 80% of our English learners in the whole United States speak Spanish in their home. So if we could know about 80% of the population, and we can know about effective evidence-based strategies for them, then how can we use that to support? The second most common language is Arabic, but it's like less than 3% in our public schools. And Chinese, less than Mandarin, less than 3%, and Vietnamese, about 1.8%. And so although every English learner counts, what we've learned, the bulk of the research has been on Spanish speaking English learners, right? But other countries have done incredible work for all different languages, but we all have something in common, that language is the foundation for literacy. And without language skills, you will not develop literacy. And I'm a speech and language pathologist and a certified dyslexia therapist, and I'm here to tell you that the students that I serve very clearly need support in their language while they're developing their literacy. So we want to put on our thinking caps about how can we incorporate language all throughout the day in the content areas, in the language arts, but also in our interventions for reading and for students who struggle with learning to read. Now, here's the issue we also have. We only have 3% of educators who have a specialization in working with English learners, right? And some states, I'm in a project in a state that doesn't even offer, that specialization. So I'm hoping that this book will help you to really hone in and learn all about this subject matter. And I hope it prepares you for working with these students, or as you work with these students, it can enhance your instruction. All right. So thank you so much for being here. It means really the world to me. I'm so grateful. So let's start from the beginning. For those of you who don't have the book, how does chapter 1 begin? Chapter 1 begins with really looking at, what do we know? How did this come about that we would work with English learners, and how did we even get to the point where we have standards for English learners? And so we think back at the federal initiatives, and the very first initiative very clearly began way back when, in those 1960s, actually 1968, where we had that Bilingual Education Act. And it was called the Title 7 of that Elementary and Secondary Education Act. But really, what it was really thinking about, what are we doing? We have all these students who do not speak English as their first language. They're in our schools. They're not understanding the instruction. And very clearly, something must be done. There were some very famous lawsuits that came about, particularly in San Francisco, for the San Francisco School District, for the Asian population of students that weren't getting the services that they needed. And as we think about that, we think about, when were we really talking very clearly about literacy and English learners? And it began with No Child Left Behind. And I'm going to tell you, I feel privileged to have, lived through this, and to have, had a model in my own city that served as a model of prevention that could go into state law and eventually into our national law. And whenever something rolls out, there's always, oh my God, all we're doing is testing, when we need to teach, and then test. And I agree. We spend a lot of time on testing. But what we need to know, we need to have some kind of idea about, what do they know? What don't they know? Where are they right now in their abilities for language and literacy? Because that affects their learning. And so as we progress into the Every Student Succeeds Act, we now see, where English learners and what we're going to do with English learners was really, talked about and left to the states. And each of the states have, their standards, and many have the Common Core state standards, but also the language proficiency standards. And we are going to talk about some of those standards. And I know you might have recently seen the new WIDA standards that came out, and Pamela and her colleagues there shared that with me. And I think we're going to be talking some about that this evening. But next week, I really want to dig deep into that, because it's about language proficiency. And we're going to be talking about that in depth next week. And so I'm going to kind of give you a little sneak peek this week. And then next week, we'll dive in there and really speak in more detail about that. And so this is going to be very important. And so the majority of states have the Common Core state standards, and many states are using those WIDA, and we're looking at those language proficiency standards. Some states have like their own standards. But as we look at that, and as we think about that, we have to think about the child at the very center. The child's at the very core. And in there, we have that context, that school context, the family, the home context, and the community, right? And all of this is an interplay for our students. And so here in the United States, we have programs and program models. And so you're probably, if you work with an English learner, you probably apply one of these program models in your schools. So when we speak about English as a second language, so here in this model, the goal is for the students to learn English while being given that support and those strategies that are known to be effective for English learners. We also have structured English immersion. And I'm going to tell you, so when we think about that, we think about the students coming in and right away moving into the English language, moving into English literacy. And we do see that. But when we're thinking about that, is we're thinking about, well, how, maybe we don't have persons who can deliver English as a second language, or could we also think about it this way? Some people are thinking about it more that English language while they're thinking about their language proficiency. I mean, you can't do that without thinking about their language proficiency. Where I live, they're doing a transitional bilingual education model. And what that means is the students come in and they get their native language instruction, native language and native language literacy instruction. And as they're developing, they're learning oral language and moving into the English language. And under transitional, they might call it early exit, which would mean typically by the third grade, they've already done their native language literacy and are moving primarily into total English, and or late exit, which would mean somewhere around like about the fifth grade or so. The dual language program model is becoming more widely used than before. And here, what we're looking at is you can look at it like a 50-50. In some cases, there's English speakers wanting to learn another language, right? And the native, maybe like let's say English and Spanish. So the English speakers are learning Spanish and the Spanish speakers are learning English, and they spend about 50% of their day in the two languages. And so that would be considered two-way dual language versus the one-way dual language is where you're primarily looking at that student who's going to be learning the two languages as they move along. And primarily it's with those English learners. So those are the different kinds of program models. So many of you, maybe you want to put in the chat box, what kind do you have, and what model do you use in your school? That would be interesting for me to know. And so when you get that answer, if you want to share that, that would be great, Patton team. So as we look at that, I do have something to tell you about that. And I'm going to tell you something that wasn't published, and there's always something behind the research. So some of the, many states have high numbers. And so we were in like the top 3 states of English learners and conducting research with the different models and trying to figure out, what works for what child, for whom, for how long, how should it be developed. And then we ran into a big problem. And here's the problem I want to talk to you about is that it's very difficult to tell you those answers about what works for whom, for how long, because number one, we don't have the fidelity of the implementation. There was so much variance as we went through the schools and we were measuring, what language were they using? And the variance was in the same hallway. It was from grade level to grade level and from campus to campus. And so to get these large scale studies to look at, what works best for what child, right? And for how long, and what are those features? Very difficult to do because we're lacking in the fidelity of that implementation. And we see a lot of switching of children from one program model to another and moving from here to there. And obviously that leaves gaps in their education. So that's something we have to think about. What can we do better to implement and then to figure out what's working, how it's working, and for what type of English learner and for how long. So that's something that we need to work on, fidelity of the implementation. But we do have the multi-tiered systems of support. And what I want to tell you, and you received a link for the multi-tiered systems of support for English learners. We've been working since 2016 on what's called this model demonstration project from the Office of Special Education Programs. And I've been on the team called Project Ellipsis. And what we're looking at is as we think about these systems of support, so we know that the multi tiers that we think of, typically tier one being that general instruction in the classroom by the general educator, the general education teacher. Tier two, we think about that being targeted small group intervention, not more than 5 students. In our studies, we never had more than 5 students, and very targeted. And we say like a minimum of 30 minutes a day, but really with specific targets in mind to help the students improve. And then that tier three is that intense intervention, whereby the students are going to, maybe be served by special educator specialist, or by maybe the general education teacher conducting the intensive intervention, or by an interventionist, and maybe not in special education. So there's different models about how tier three will work. But what I want to talk to you about is a new model for the tier three system that we came up with from this project of OSEP. In this model that you have here, what I want you to think about is this, and I'm going to explain it. This is from our project Ellipsis. And in that multi-tiered systems of support, we're going to be getting into that. There's some other resources, and we'll be, as we go through the chapters, we'll be referring to certain ones that would be aligned to the chapters. But if you look here at tier one, I want to just tell you, so tier one would be that general core instruction that I described to you, right? But as we're thinking, so I want you to look right here at this blue section, all right? So here we're thinking about culturally and linguistically responsive teaching. And what that means is our framework is for working with the students is going to be from the model of an asset. How are we going to get the students engaged? Well, we're going to be providing them with opportunities, right, to relate, things that would be culturally responsive to them, that they would have some kind of connection to. And linguistically, we're going to be thinking about where they are in this linguistic development, so that our teaching is always going to consider that from an asset, from their culture and their language and all the linguistic knowledge that they do have. Now, when we think about that, we're going to think about these terms. So let's look at basic, intermediate, advanced. And so as we look here, whether that be a student who is primarily served in the core instruction, or a student who's receiving some small group instruction in tier two, or a student in that tier three setting where maybe it's provided by special education intensely, minimum of 45 minutes a day, or is it the general educator who's the interventionist? So there's different models of how tier three will be. But all the while, for the English learners, what looks different about this multi-tiered system of support is that we're paying attention to their language proficiency, whether the student is at a basic level in their native or second language, at the intermediate level in their first or second language, or at the advanced level, because that makes a difference in how we should be scaffolding. We have to scaffold for their language so that they'll be very, very likely to achieve the targets that we have in mind for literacy. And so this multi-tiered system of support we've added that cultural and linguistic responsive teaching and added really understanding those language features of our students, whether they're at the basic, the intermediate, or the advanced stage, right? And so we'll be talking more about this and delving deeper into this as we move into the delivery of these interventions and of what we need to do, and as we look at those language proficiency. And I'll talk to you about some other tools that we've developed that, and maybe I'll share some that haven't been published but are on that road to being published for a model.
So
Okay.
did you want to take some questions? There are some in the chat.
I think that would be great.
Okay. You had asked about the different models, and when I look through the list, oh my goodness, I see a lot of ESL listed, but I see two-way immersion, SEI, ESOL,
Esau, okay.
TBE, DL,
Okay, transitional.
structured English.
Okay.
And there's a question in that list, and this is a big question
Oh,
from Eileen, but it says, I'm curious about the dual language models in districts with large numbers of different languages. In my tiny school, we have 23 languages and the most spoken language is Bengali.
oh,
So that is a big question, but
wow.
I thought we'd check in with that. And then there was just a few maybe that we'll check in before we move on.
Yeah.
There
So,
were a few more. One was asking how the labels equated to WIDA. So the relationship between the WIDA and the three basic, intermediate, and advanced.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then somebody asked if you were going to be speaking to the SLIFE students at all, some strategies to support them as well.
But specifically SLIFE, who are beginning learners in secondary.
Okay. You know what? I have some very specific things that we will do for the development of their phonological awareness and phonics skills and language skills. And so that will be great when we address those chapters. Virginia Gonzalez will be talking to us about the phonological awareness, and I'll join in as well. And then Ken Nasser and myself will be talking about the phonics and how we approach it from the model of using those cross-linguistic features and what we can do about it. And so in your school with the 23 languages, I mean, first of all, I mean, school districts have to make a lot of decisions regarding, personnel and expertise and also the expense, right? It is costly. So there's so much that goes into developing a program as such. I almost think about, other countries, and I think about, when do they, when you go to Europe, for example, everyone comes out minimally bilingual, biliterate, typically multilingual, multiliterate. And how are they able to do that? And when you think about that, you think about the communities that they live in and how diverse. And so it's almost like we have assets. And so for us, we use, the assets in the community that, that speak the other languages. And since we're on the border, people come through and sometimes they're here, temporarily, and then they move on or they stay here permanently. But I think, really I think we should talk about that, but I think, when you have that many languages, it's very difficult to provide those services for all children. And so probably you're doing more like a ESL model, I imagine, at this time, and probably not a dual language. So we'll talk more about that, but we are going to get into those WIDA standards and talk about, and especially next week, when we're talking about the language proficiency. So when you're thinking about your English learners and you think, what I'd like to ask and have you write in the chat box so I can kind of get a sense about the standards that you use for literacy. Are the majority of you using the Common Core state standards? Are you, what are you doing about addressing the English learners through your standards? So as we think about, I'm going to stop share right here. And if you're familiar with WIDA, so we think about WIDA and we think about the big ideas of WIDA, right? And so the big ideas is equity, access, right? It's about another big idea, collaboration, and making sure that everything we do is through a very functional and useful and purposeful. But in addition to that, making sure that we are providing um, instruction through multiple modalities, so that students have the opportunity to respond the best way that they learn. We're in there about language use, and we know students, and I say this, to know a word, and to expand your vocabulary, students have to have a minimum of 12 opportunities, and some research points all the way up to 17 opportunities for these students to learn, this new vocabulary, these words. And best way to learn them is through are thinking about those content areas and WIDA really does also point that out, related to language arts, all the language around math, the language around social studies, the language around science, right? And thinking about that while we're also thinking about their proficiency levels, whether they're at those very beginning levels or moving on to that more intermediate or advanced levels. And we often say it takes 5 to 7 years to develop very fully the comparable language skills of a monolingual, for example, in this country, English speaker. All right. So we want to know about this language and we want to develop. And as you're working on anything in the content areas, you should always be incorporating language with those literacy skills. All right. So what did we find out about the standards? What do we know? Patenting.
Let's see. We have
Mostly the PAELP standards with the WIDA standards. I don't know if those are the new WIDA standards,
Okay.
but using those WIDA standards. And then I have also seen other states. So we have some people here from other places. In Pennsylvania, we have the PA core standards, which are very similar to the Common Core.
Uh-huh.
And some other people are saying that they're using the PA English language proficiency pieces.
state
Okay.
WIDA.
Yep. Oh,
Uh,
some people noted that English learner overlays from our Pennsylvania Department of Ed Standards Aligned System website.
Okay. Very good.
Lots.
Kansas is here too. So their English language proficiency standards in the CCSS.
Okay. Excellent. So really the states, were required to think about these language proficiency standards, and we have that guidance through those, WIDA, and can take from there, these effective practices. But as we think about this, there's a literacy brief, and you might get that in the chat box. The multi-tiered systems of support for English learners with and without disabilities. And so some of you, I'm asking first, did any of you read that literacy brief? And second, when we think about that, what are those effective literacy instruction? What is it? What are those core features that we need to incorporate into that tier 1 and tier 2 instruction? So as we think about that, does somebody want to, before I can bring that up, but somebody want to reflect upon that and kind of share, if you read it, and if there's a takeaway for you from the document? You can be brave. Let me bring it up. Can you see it here? All right, so as we think about the multi-tiered systems of support and thinking about the implementation of this for English learners. You see here, what are we talking about? The core components being that high quality, evidence-based language and literacy instruction that we know was, tested with these populations of students. And we talked about that culturally and linguistically responsive teaching, including language supports. I was in the day when, thinking about where, oh no, you cannot use the native language. But of course, we want to use that in a strategic manner, not incidentally. But also, how are we assessing these students, and are we regularly reviewing their data? And what about those students who really are demonstrating disabilities? And what kind of professional development support do we have from our school districts, from our regions, and from our state for the strategic, implementation of these strategies with our students? All right. And so as you look here, this is our project ellipsis. And here it describes our work. And when we really were looking at the role of language for our English learners and thinking about how we could help our teachers with that differentiated language and giving them those very meaningful opportunities, whether they for listening, speaking, reading, and writing, but doing that across the content areas, just like your WIDA standards recommend. And then when possible, using that first language support during instruction to make connections. And I want to tell you that, for example, there's many languages that, English is borrowed from many languages, but about 60% of the English language comes from Latin. And so if we're thinking about Latin-based languages, there's many opportunities for words that are similar in spelling and meaning, and words that have those common word parts like a common prefix or root or suffix, and all of that, thinking about that in a cross-linguistic framework can really help our students, and especially during that core instruction, but also when we're trying to implement that, intervention. We also know that our students are doing what we call twice the cognitive work. They're going back and forth in both languages and thinking about their resources. And so that cross-linguistic transfer can develop that meta-linguistic awareness, right? And so we want to do that, but we want to be very purposeful in how we plan around that. And as a speech language pathologist, I mean, it's like I work with children that have language disorders, but as I work with them, I already know, the targets that we're going to get from listening and speaking and reading and writing, and what those opportunities are going to be. And we also have to work very closely with our families so that they can engage and they can understand the kind of work that we're doing. And so some of the things, and I want to ask you about this, for the English learners, we know that they have high demands linguistically and cognitively, but what we talk about here are the non-linguistic tools. So using those visuals, very important for our English learners, and using those organizers, those graphic organizers or advanced organizers to anchor that instruction and to support the students in making sense of that content. And what we might also look at those different levels of language proficiency. Some of you were describing middle school to me, like, oh, we've got these middle schoolers, students in middle school that are just coming, and they're just at the very beginning stages of that English language. And so they're going to need a lot of support. But if my students have sufficient native language skills, that's going to be very helpful for that second language learning. All right. And so we also want to make sure that so here's the other issue that we have with our English learners. We will have English learners who have deficits in literacy. And what happens to these students is they don't get identified. And why don't they get identified? Because it's very challenging for schools to determine, is this language and learning second language, or is it in fact a learning disability, a specific learning disability in the area of reading? And so we've got to be paying attention in what has been that instruction, that opportunity, what kinds of tier 2 and small group interventions have we given? And as we're looking at that, have we looked at that high quality language? How are their peers doing? Are they doing similar to their peers, or is it not similar to the peers? But everything that we do and what is different about the interventions is that you have to incorporate language and targeted language while you're conducting those interventions in reading. And so this is crucial. What's also crucial is that as an educator, that you have knowledge of that first language and second language development, as well as first language literacy and second language literacy. So everything that you do is going to be determined upon how well are they doing in their language and language skills, and how well are they doing in their reading skills. What do they know? What don't they know? And how am I going to make adjustments for what I had planned, but it's not working? So what kind of scaffolds should I bring in? All right. So any questions on that before I go into talking about these universal screening measures? So any discussion? I can stop.
There's a question about, there you go. How do you recommend assessing L1 literacy skills?
Yeah, so it's, and I'm glad I have Dr. Tritas here as well. We've been working on a project for the last 3 years, really looking at what do we think, what do we know from research that is essential. And we've started with the English language, we've looked at the Spanish language, and we have other colleagues that we hope will look at other languages for us, such as Arabic and Mandarin. But what we know is that no matter what the language, there's some universal skills. And even if the languages are pictographic, they're not alphabetic languages, we know the importance of being able to process sounds in the language and produce them. So the skills of phonological awareness are not only important in alphabetic languages, they're also important in non-alphabetic language. It appears to be a universal skill. And so, and just think about this, what we found in our research, and you can find this if it's Russian in English, Italian in English, French in English, Spanish in English. When you have that skill, for example, the ability to blend sounds together, or the ability to manipulate the initial sound, when you could do it in one language, you can do it in other languages. For example, if I give you a word in Portuguese, falo, and I ask you to tell me the first sound of falo, you're going to be able to tell me what that first sound was. You might even be able to tell me all the sounds, o. And so it's not language specific, but it is that ability to process the sounds. So what we know is we will look at phonological awareness. We will look at that ability. So if it's an alphabetic language, we'll look at the structure of that alphabetic language and how well they'll know, that combination of the symbol to the sound. If it's a non-alphabetic language, then, they're going to be looking at other kinds of symbols, but from those symbols, there are spoken sounds that go with those symbols. And sometimes they're pictographic. Some of the languages are very syllabic. But nonetheless, you do need to look at phonological awareness, and you do need to look at their ability to transcribe that print into that spoken. And then, of course, we want to be looking at how well they're able to do that, how well they're able to, if they're able to do that with accuracy and with ease, with fluency, and how much of it are they understanding, and do they have enough language and vocabulary to understand? Eric Tritas, do you want to add anything to that since I have you here tonight?
Yes, I think that some of the studies have shown that the neurological underpinnings for children that are individuals that have reading difficulties are the same in every language. So we see issues associated with phonological awareness and the ability to connect either sounds or syllables to symbols. The non-alphabetic languages like Mandarin, the symbols represent either short words or syllables. And I think that there's a definite universal approach to acquiring literacy skills that way.
Yeah.
Also in the history, it's very important to look at the language proficiency in the native language because that is going to be critical. And the ability to communicate with the parents regarding those issues is going to be important because it will tell you. I had a particular patient that the father said, this child does not understand what I tell him as well as my other children. And the school was insisting that he was having an English language problem. And he was an EL student, and that was the difficulty. And the father said, he doesn't understand me in English or Spanish. It doesn't really matter. It's the same problem. So there's the same neurological issues in every language, and the history will tell you very clearly what's going on, as Elsa was pointing out in the developmental markers in terms of whether the child met the language milestones early on, and as they get into school, are they able to recognize the alphabet? Do they understand rhyming, and can they, match rhyming words and things like that? Because that will give you an idea of phonological awareness.
Right. So, and even just thinking about, so everybody kiss this left side of your brain, this left temporal parietal lobe. So the areas over here, my language center, connecting, and my phonological awareness, and it just goes like this pretty darn fast. And it seems like such a natural process, but it's not natural. Language is a natural process. Humans are meant to speak. Literacy is invented, but literacy is language-based. And so you must have those great foundational skills. So the case that Dr. Treatise is talking to you about this child that doesn't, isn't able to follow instructions and doesn't really understand, that child's going to have trouble, reading and trouble understanding what they read. And so that's going to be very, very important.
There is a question, Elsa, from Diane.
Yes.
She says, so some of my students speak their language, but do not know how to read it or write it. So the sound is not linked to anything. Where would you begin?
Yeah. So depending on the language, and that's typically, like, we get students that just, have no prior schooling. So what I would say, depending on the language and whether it's an alphabetic and whether there's somebody there that could also provide that. But what we find is when we work in that native language, we have great results for that biliteracy. If it's not possible, then we work in the English language, but every opportunity we get, is this a sound you've ever heard in your language? Can you say it? Is it similar? So that they're making these meta-linguistic and they're processing these new sounds. So for example, in the English language, it's so hard to do these sounds like sh, or, right? All those vowel sounds and those digraphs and those diphthongs, that's very difficult. And so we have to make sure that they can discriminate. Can they process and discriminate? And I like to talk about an approximation model. And so when I work with these students, and for example, let's say, I like to talk about, one of the hardest sounds in English to learn for our students is a sound like for the letter J, right? And that is so troublesome, because it's not in their language. But in their language, they have a sound like RCH, exactly like that. And so I tell them, you've got that sound already. Guess what? All we have to do is say that very sound, but this time you're going to say it with much force and you're going to turn on your voice box. Let's first say it how you know. Ch, ch, ch. Now let's say it with your voice box on. J, j, j. Turn off your voice. Ch, ch, ch. Turn it on. J. And that's the discrimination. And I like to tease about why I went into speech and language pathology. My father one time was in a commercial, and it was with Coach Tom Landry. And it was this whole thing, and Tom Landry says, right, Ray, my father's nickname. And my father turns to him and says, right, Coach. And every one of my friends would laugh because they saw my dad on TV saying, right, Coach. And I said, Dad, I'm going to teach you how to say coach, right? And it's all about that discrimination and that production and getting to the point where we can do approximation. And if I don't know the language, I can ask the student, is there any sound that, is kind of like that sound? Can you think of it? And can I teach you about how to do that? And we'll be talking about that when we talk about phonological awareness and phonics chapters, about how you actually teach that. And here's the other thing. You're never going to get them into speech pathology because the speech pathologists, their caseloads are, 50 to 100 kids, right? But if we teach you how to fix this, and it's not that hard to do, then how they listen and process will be how they speak. How they listen and process that speech, those new speech sounds, and produce them will be how they read and write. So you've got to get precision in the auditory discrimination and in their production, so then it can translate to that higher form of language, reading and writing. So I got to get that listening, processing the sounds, getting that in correctly, producing them correctly, to read them and write them correctly.
So would you like to take a couple more questions, or would you like to continue with the content? And then, okay. From Heather, if a student has difficulty in both languages, would you then screen for a language impairment? Especially as an SLP, this is wonderful that they're asking you.
Yes,
What if the parents report that they don't have trouble with their L1, but they aren't progressing in English compared to their peers? Is testing okay?
No. So so here's the issue. And like Dr. Tritas is always saying, and we talk about this all the time, we never get a pure case. So in other words, we are experts at, he's an expert in ADD and dyslexia, and I'm an expert in dyslexia. You never get a student just with only one thing, it seems like. But it makes sense to me that if they're so there will be those students, and we call it, the garden variety of readers who have language issues, and also they're going to have comprehension issues, right? Students with dyslexia typically are okay in their language skills, but they have trouble when we talk about that simple view of reading, that, you have decoding times that comprehend times language equals, reading and reading comprehension. But the students with dyslexia oftentimes are lacking that decoding. My English learners, typically they break the code, right? Especially the Spanish speakers, but where they lack is in that language. And so we have to develop those language skills. And so what we talk about is, how can we do this in simple ways? Number one, how can we do it through a structured read aloud? Number two, how can we do it in the content areas? And we're going to be talking about like kind of procedures of, when we do things that are routines, then the children start to think in those routines, and they start to think metalinguistically and start to gather, oh, I need to be thinking about words in this way. And I teach about every word has a phonological feature, sounds. Every word has not only the phonological feature, it has what we call either the morphological or semantic feature. It has meaning, and it can be meaning of the word or meaning of those word parts. Every word that I know has a function, and that's that grammar. And every word that I use has to have the ability to use it, and I have to use it in different contexts. And so what I want to say is that we can be working on language and vocabulary through the framework of what those components of language are, but we can also add that to the literacy. And we're going to be talking about that more. And so what we, so if they're learning that new language, remember what I said about using those visuals. We have them using, you know, that total physical response. We know those are very good strategies for English learners, but we do everything in a systematic manner so they get into those routines, and then they start thinking that way. Oh, I'm going to think about the sounds. I'm going to think about the meaning. I'm going to think about maybe even the orthography, how it's spelled. I'm going to think about how it's used. Can it be used formally or informally? Is it used in like in an idiom? And I'm the type of person, like when I think about the English language, I'm always trying to learn idioms in English because I find them so fascinating, and I haven't experienced all the idioms that you've experienced. And so I find that a very high form of language, and that even if I'm considered an proficient English speaker, that there's still wonderful, and Eric Treatise will say that too. We don't know all the idioms of the English language, and kind of like the different, of course you don't know in our language either, but that's a very high form of language. So we have to work on those language, but I want to teach you a very systematic approach to doing that will be a routine, that will incorporate visuals, that will incorporate the total physical response, that will incorporate that native language in there, and that will incorporate all the features, phonological, right, the semantic, the morphology, and the orthography, and the use, the pragmatics, and the syntax.
We may have time for just one more question, but there is one from one of our participants that I'll probably share with you, Jen Clinton. We don't want you to think that we've forgotten you. We'll pass those questions on to Dr. Cardenas-Hagan so she can answer them for you during this week. But it was about a transfer chart. And I know that ASHA has a number of really wonderful charts where we can compare and contrast languages, phonemes, and what have you. Would you recommend anywhere else? And we can include those resources.
Yeah. So my colleague Diane August put on, I think it's on Colorín Colorado, we'll have to dig, where it has the cognates. And in this book, we have the sounds. So we talk about the sounds. I don't know if it has all of them. Well, in this book, we have the Spanish and English relations, for example, on the vowels and consonants, and also the diphthongs. And then we discuss Arabic and discuss Vietnamese and Chinese, and on those structures as well. And that will be on week 4, chapter 4, right after Dr. Treatise. But yeah, Colorín Colorado, I think, has it. And I'll have to look and see if they're still up there, but it does have those cognates. And the way we know that works best, just like your WIDA standards will say, when we think about those, you know, certain content areas, when we think we're studying about social studies, we're studying about this topic, we're studying about math, you know, so many of these words, so come from, Greek, or they come from Latin, right? Or the Anglo-Saxon words. And so especially the Latin and the Greek will be cognates with English.
Okay, we're down to just about 2 minutes.
Okay.
That was a fast hour.
There are about 8 more questions that we have for you. So we'll aggregate those and put them into an email. I highlighted the ones that I got that were answered, or kind of approximately answered.
Okay.
But then I'll email those to Dr. Castro, and she can email those off to you.
Okay.
Yes, it went really fast. It was wonderful.
Gosh.
It was wonderful. It does appear that some of the folks received emails with things and some did not. So certainly I'll work with my program assistant to make sure that you get all the information. Dr. Cardenas-Hagan is working on the questions for next week.
Yes.
We'll make sure that all of you get those. And if she has any related resources, she'll share those as well. It'll be the same thing with all the chapter leads. They'll share questions with us to support your reading of the chapter. If you don't have the book, that's fine too. Come and learn. Either way, we're so glad to have you here. We are recording these sessions, so they will be housed on a playlist on the Patent YouTube channel. But in order to keep everything kind of neatly packaged for you, where the recordings, the chapter questions, the related resources that the chapter leads will share, or Dr. Cardenas-Hagan will share, we will create a Padlet. Padlet's like a digital bulletin board. One way it can be used is to curate information all in one spot. So when we share that initial Padlet with you, it will have just this past week's recording. It will have the resources from this week. And then each week, that link, just keep going to that same link and it'll build over time. So by the time you're done, you'll have everything related to this book or just all this learning you're going to engage in for the next 11 weeks in one nice spot. Which is nice to have. But of course, the recordings will be on the Patent YouTube channel as well and playlist. If you have colleagues who weren't able to come, we encourage you to share these resources with them, to share the links from the Patent YouTube channel. This is really important, vital learning, and we want everyone to learn it. The patent folks too, we're learning with you as we go along. I want to thank my colleagues, Lisa Bola, Kirsten DeRoche. Two of my colleagues came in and I didn't see earlier, Amy Cavalier and Francine Dutrasik. Thank you so much for also being here. Thank you as well for all of you being here. You've all worked hard all day long, and here you are joining we had about 270 people in here learning together tonight. So thank you so very much for that. As I said, at the conclusion of each session, we will have a poll. If you are need Act 48 credit, you'll need to do this poll at the end of every session. In order to get Act 48 credit, you do have to attend all 11 of these wonderful book study sessions. And at the conclusion, then you'll receive your Act 48 credits. So I'm going to launch that poll right now. Please make sure that you complete it if you'd like Act 48 credit. If you don't need Act 48 credit, that's fine. We just want to thank you once again so very, very much for being with us this evening. Thank you to Dr. Eric Treatise for joining us. And of course, to Dr. Elsa Cardenas-Hagen. She'll be joining us again next week as the lead of Chapter 2 for Language and Literacy Development. It's a session you don't want to miss. So I'll launch the poll right now.
Oh, thank you for a great